All I require is to sit in the sun, read my book, alone.
I will leave you now to your book.
That is all I ask.
Books, young man, books, thousands of them. If time wasn't so important, I'd show you something. My library, thousands of books.
Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm the host of this Trek Book Club podcast. This is a companion podcast to the Trek Book Club on Twitter, where we read and discuss Trek books approximately every 6 weeks. To learn more about the club, go to @TrekBookClub on Twitter. For this episode, we will be reviewing the third book of the Coda trilogy, Oblivion's Gate, by David Mack, which was the club's book selection for September 2022. To help me discuss this novel, which not only concluded the Coda trilogy, but also the post-Nemesis Litverse, we have fellow book club member and co-host of the Crusher Convo podcast, Michelle, joining me today. Hey, Michelle, thanks for joining.
Hey, Peter, how are you? Thanks for having me.
For our first-time guests, we'd like to have them give their Trek origin story and their Trek novel origin story. So if you can share that with our audience, that would be great.
Sure. So my Trek story kind of is in two parts. So growing up, my dad was into the original series. And so he got me into the original series. And we started with the movies and then started watching the original series episodes. And so that was my Trek growing up. So I loved Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. And Dr. McCoy was my favorite character. And I just absolutely love TOS. And I'm really enjoying some of the things that they're doing now with like Strange New Worlds and how we're imagining these characters in new ways. I enjoyed the 2009 Star Trek movie and the kind of reboot as well, because I love those characters and I love to see them reimagined too. In the Litverse, in that part of my Trek journey, the first novel I believe I read, this first Star Trek novel, was Shadows on the Sun, which features Dr. McCoy and delves a little bit more into his personal life after the events of The Undiscovered Country. So it's been a while since I've read that book. But again, I love the doctors in Star Trek. And that kind of leads into what I'm into now as an adult. When I heard Star Trek Picard was coming out, a lot of people convinced me, my friends who were TNG fans, when I was a TOS fan, they're like, you've got to give Picard a chance, meaning TNG and him as a captain. And after Generations, I kind of didn't want to because of how that ended. And I was a little salty about the Next Generation. But I decided to give them a shot in around, I guess it was 2018, 2019 when they announced Star Trek Picard, got back into the fandom through TNG and just binge watched TNG and really loved it. And Dr. Beverly Crusher became my favorite character there. And my love for Dr. Beverly Crusher has overflowed into a podcast that a friend of mine, Jessie from Twitter, created. She created that podcast, started on Twitter Spaces over the summer of 2022. And we have bonded over our enjoyment of The Good Doctor. And yeah, so then I got into the Litverse in a whole new way with the post-Nemesis novels and started reading like Death in Winter and Losing the Peace, the Destiny trilogy, the Typhon Pact, all of Greater Than the Sum. There's so many great books that do great service to Beverly Crusher, because one of the things that I felt in my Trek journey there was that Dr. Crusher wasn't explored that much, especially in the movies. She was kind of non-existent in the movies, and she only got a few episodes here and there in TNG. So we view everything through the lens of Dr. Beverly Crusher when we do our podcast. And so I could view the Litverse a little bit through that lens. So you might see that as we review the Coda trilogy and particularly Oblivion's Gate. And it's why I loved the Coda trilogy so much, is because they really gave Beverly her due. And I also am a Picard and Beverly shipper, unabashedly. I ship them hard, and you may not, and that's okay. But, everybody in the audience there, and I understand that, but I'm a big Crusher shipper, bonker, whatever you want to call them nowadays, and am excited to see what they're going to do with Picard season 3, which is currently coming out.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Yeah, with season 3, Picard's Beverly relationship has been one of the sort of central foundations of the storyline this year. So
yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, so we're going to be interested in seeing how it all shakes out then. So great.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. This actually is a good time for a little bit of spoiler warning. So I just wanted to let our audience know that we are recording this episode right after Picard season 3, episode 5, Imposters. So this is a warning that we will discuss spoilers related to the Coda trilogy, including Oblivion's Gate, but we may also touch upon other episodes within the Star Trek universe of shows, including Picard. So if you haven't seen Picard season 3, or if you haven't read Coda yet, please watch those first and then come back.
Pretty much red alert for all of Star Trek right now. Red alert.
Yes, that's right. Everything is could be up for grabs. So, okay. So for the next section, I just wanted to give a high level summary of the first two books, just to give a little bit of a context and foundation. So we're not going to really talk about book 1, Moments Asunder, or book 2, The Ashes of Tomorrow.
Which were both lovely books. Great books.
Book 1, it was more of an action-focused novel, which established the Davidian's threat, introduced the Nagas and the Avatar. There was also various destruction of time portals and time entities, like the Guardian of Forever, the Axis of Time, which was from a Temporal Investigations, the novel series, I recall.
Right, with Wesley Crusher at the center of it all, which I absolutely loved.
Yes, yes. And yeah, one thing I like about the Coda trilogy was Wesley did have a very central role in the trilogy. So he was really the leader, the connecting thread among everything that was going on.
They paid off everything that they set up in TNG with Wesley Crusher in the Coda trilogy, I have to say. And while it was confusing at times, I absolutely adored the way that they weaved him into the plot and had him problem solving as a competent adult traveler with Picard, with all the other characters, with Beverly, even the interactions with his brother, brilliant. And Dayton Ward, James Swallow, and David Mack did the best job they could with the assignment they were given. And we could talk about the ending toward the end, but I do really appreciate the work they did on this trilogy.
No, that's a great observation. I think they did it very good. I really enjoyed it. And the book also ended on a sad note with the death of Captain Ezri Dax of the Aventine. So that was also, for me, one of the first instances in which I got the impression that the stakes are really high in the novels, and going to be curious on how it's going to work out over the next few novels. So that was book 1. For book 2, The Ashes of Tomorrow by James Swallow, we have Captain Picard going to Starbase 1 to try to get Starfleet to recognize the threat. That was the beginning of getting resistance from Starfleet, in which they didn't see the threat as serious as Captain Picard did. So there was a stealing of the Enterprise scene, which is actually one of my favorite sections of the book. It's like a homage to The Search for Spock. And then they went into DS9 for the second half of the book, in which they met with Captain Rolaren, who's in charge of DS9. They met Chief O'Brien with Quark, with Nog, who's now officer on I think it was the Satakoi, which was one of the starships near there. And then we met up with Jake and Keiko. And then the book itself ended with the destruction of DS9 in order to stop the Davidians from entering into the Alpha Quadrant. So that was so it ended on a very serious note as well.
Yes, I think you made a nice parallel. I think either in our conversation prior or maybe in the notes here, I know that you had mentioned that parallel between Picard coming up against resistance with Starfleet in this novel versus him also experiencing that with the Romulan evacuation efforts in Star Trek Picard. So again, we're met with that.
Yeah, I think in some of these more recent stories, it covers Picard having the resistance or just having other people not accepting, his solutions or his proposals.
Yeah, more bad roles, except I don't know. I still am mixed on Crazy Riker. I feel like his character was wasted a bit in these novels, but it's interesting to see it in parallel to what Picard season 3 is doing and setting it up in a different way, maybe, of Picard and Riker, kind of a little versus there.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think we with season 3, which came out, after these novels, so it's interesting to compare how those characters are similar, or they following the similar path in in these two media. Okay, so that's the end of book 2. So I'm going to read a short description of book 3, and then we'll dive into book 3 a little bit more. So The description, Oblivion's Gate, their final mission is their finest hour.
Right.
An impossible task. Captain Benjamin Sisko takes the Defiant into a parallel universe so that he and Data can undo the vile sabotage that triggered the temporal apocalypse. A shadow rising. Meanwhile, Admiral William Riker's grasp of reality becomes more tenuous by the minute. Can his beloved Deanna Troi free him from madness before it's too late? A daring last stand. Starfleet's heroes risk everything to set time right. But will Captain Picard let Beverly Crusher and their son die, or will he destroy the multiverse to save them?
A lot of Avengers Endgame vibes in this book.
Yes. Actually, I did. I got a lot of Avengers Endgame and a little bit of TNG's All Good Things, the series finale as well. I think, kind of having but definitely Avenger Endgame and had a good vibe on it. So what did you think of overall impressions of Oblivion's Gate, Michelle?
Sure. Well, it's interesting. The first time I read this, I hadn't seen DS9 yet. So, kind of revisiting this through the lens of what I now know about those characters, while still not having a complete grasp. I haven't read all the books in the post-Nemesis verse, unfortunately, but it made it a little more personal. And I do think this novel does a great job of balancing action and character. So you get those character beats and those character moments of those beloved figures that everyone had been so invested in for 20 plus years. And I appreciated the storytelling, the struggle about what the weight of what they were doing was so vast. I mean, this is universe ending stuff. And the fact that it all came down to pretty much Picard and Beverly at the end. And I felt like that was kind of a nice bookend with how I feel those two characters start out in TNG, in Encounter and Farpoint. There's always some sort of connection between them, but at the end they ground each other and they make each other better. And so I did enjoy that dynamic as it expanded throughout the Litverse, but also how it's explored in this last novel. Because for me, it was Picard season 1 and 2. I did have a disappointment because everything that we got in the novels that I had known of and that I had in my mind going into Picard season 1, because after I binge watched TNG, I did get involved in the Litverse a bit. I was just flabbergasted that no one mentioned Beverly Crusher in Picard seasons 1 and 2. But I think that David Mack was, and we'll explore his comments later on, I think you had said. So when we get to that, David Mack had just done a fabulous job of really showcasing Beverly Crusher and getting the emotion from her, the action from her, her feelings for Wesley and Renee and everything that was going on. But she also is a scientist. And yeah, she gets to kill the Borg Queen and rescue Jean-Luc. And I love that. So, I mean, there's so many themes in this book, the themes about endings, the themes about what happens after and will we be remembered and is it worth it, the sacrifice, the needs of the many versus the needs of the few or the one, right? So I love that. I don't know, sitting here now, if I do love the fact that they have obliterated the timeline so that it basically never happened. But I do feel like it was a very meta commentary of what was happening to the Litverse because of the on-screen components. So overall, I enjoyed Oblivion's Gate in a way that was soul-crushing. In a way, fandom soul-crushing, not. But I also felt like I could see the other side of it, where I did hear fans were a bit crushed by the ending. But I understand David Mack's point of view too, the beauty of the sacrifice and that there is hope. And the book ends on hope. It doesn't end with their destruction. It ends with Picard moving through these different Picards and these different timelines until we land in the prime timeline of Last Best Hope, of Picard season 1. And maybe that little bit of memory and that little bit of the Splinter Picard is in the Picard that we are seeing on screen. And I think it does play into Picard season 3 in a big way now.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. I think I had sort of a similar reaction after I finished reading it. I enjoyed the Coda novels. I actually would think Coda is probably my second favorite Trek story after the Destiny trilogy. So it's definitely up there.
Which was also David Mack, right?
Exactly, which was also David Mack. That was his novels as well. So I think that was actually the last appearance of the Borg within the Litverse before this one. So I think they avoided it for 10 or so years before they brought them back for here. When I finished reading the novel, I actually took a break from reading Trek novels for a couple of weeks to just let everything sort of sink in. Even though I haven't read a lot of Trek novels, I've read a bunch of them. And so I was a little bit sad to see this timeline change so drastically as if it didn't exist. But then a part of me ended up thinking that all the stories still exist. This story is happens in another timeline that ended this way. But I, headcanon into thinking that all the stories are all equal. So felt a little bit better that way, just like how to handle the ending, because that is a controversial ending. They could have gone different ways. They could have, leave it alone. They could have done other things, but decided to go this route, essentially erase or move from this timeline back to the prime timeline. But I did enjoy it, and yeah.
So you had a period of mourning, and then
Yes, I did. I think it was for like maybe at least a week, maybe even two, in which I just sort of let it sit and step away from reading Trek books. Let all the events sink in. So,
which is big for you, because I know how much you love the Trek Litverse, and I know this must have been really hard coming from that perspective. Because for me, I was relatively new to all of this, so this impacted me probably in a different way than it did you, Peter, for sure.
I discovered it kind of late in my Star Trek life, so I haven't read a lot. But the ones that I did read, I still feel very attached to those stories. So I think those will still exist. Those stories still happened.
Well, I do have some words because of hopefully comfort that I gained perspective on a little bit as I was kind of revisiting this book. I didn't get a chance to kind of read it cover to cover, but I was going through spots that I remembered and character beats that I really loved when I first read it. And there is this part with Kira where I think she's with Cisco Prophet. I think it's on page 382 or 383 of the novel. Kira says, "When this ends, I will never have existed. No one will remember me or what I did." And then the Cisco Prophet lead into view beside her, a visitor in her oasis. He set his hand on top of hers on the orb of time. "We remember forever." So I feel there was a bit of hope there. I feel like even that ending with Picard going through the different versions of himself, that they live on, right? And I know that this can't be easy for fans of the novels, and I respect those who had to kind of take a step back and maybe say, well, maybe we're just not going to pay attention to the Coda trilogy and we'll make our own stories. I mean, fan fiction is huge in a lot of fandoms, especially in the Star Trek fandom, and I haven't even scratched the surface on that, but I think it's valid. It's a valid forum for fans to kind of get their own resolution to these characters that they've become so attached to, and characters that only existed in the Litverse. I'm thinking like Chen, who I had only read about through the post-Nemesis novels, and she was kind of like a daughter figure to Picard, and she died at the end of the first Coda book, Moments Asunder, and that affected me in a different way, viewing it from that lens and what she meant to Picard. And that I can understand. But I don't know if that gives you any comfort, Peter, but I'm trying.
After being, stepping away from it for now, it's like, okay, I kind of understand it, and then we'll just enjoy more adventures and read new books and
More on-screen stuff too, which is awesome.
yeah. Oh, and there's all these new shows that were, so it's a nice period of time for Star Trek.
Peak Star Trek.
For now.
Yes.
Peak is for now. For the beginnings of the book Oblivion's Gate, we had a teaser in which we saw Picard and Beverly fighting against the Davidians. And then in that chapter, it ended actually with them being defeated and getting killed. So I think for me, I was a little bit surprised at that. I just wasn't sure how that fits in with the rest of the book and seeing how that would work out. So it took me a few chapters in before I realized it was like a different timeline or a different splinter. But that was a good hook to get the action started.
Yeah, I definitely was drawn in immediately by this. And pretty much because it felt meta to me, because Picard season 1 felt very personal in the fact that Picard and Beverly weren't together and they didn't have a son, and we don't even know where Beverly Crusher was. And when I read this book, I think I think it came out just before season 2. I can't remember, but I definitely had seen season 1, and I was reading this and just thinking, this is how I felt when I saw Picard season 1, where Picard says everything in him told him not to abandon Crusher and Renee, but she was right. Somebody had to finish what Data had started. And then it goes on, and Picard disintegrates the Nega, but a fraction of a second too late, and he loses Beverly and Renee. And that line where it said, ripped from the world, from time, from him, forever. That is how I felt about what they had done to this beautiful possibility of Picard and Beverly, and them raising a child, watching Picard become a father from the beginning. Renee, those beautiful scenes. Because I kind of felt from the beginning of Coda that it was going to end with the end of the timeline, that they were going to somehow erase this timeline. So I went in with a sense of dread to begin with. And this scene, it did confuse me a little bit. I thought, are we reading the end? But I thought, no, David Mack's not going to show us the end in the beginning. There's something else going on. And then finally we get to the point where we realize, there's multiple splinters. And where did this all originate? And that reveal that this is not the prime timeline. It's the first splinter, I think they referred to it as.
Yeah, the beginning was the teaser was the second splinter. The rest was the first. Yeah.
And it's all about the choices you make. I mean, every different choice makes a different splinter, and the Davidians are feeding on that, right? And I didn't care for I love that they brought the Davidians back as like a bad guy, but they weren't after the first book, I felt they weren't the most compelling because there was no real way to be diplomatic. There was no thinking yourself out of the problem. It was still sci-fi, but there wasn't that moment of morality where, they're just morally horrible. There's nothing redeeming about the Davidians. There's no way to question what they're doing is wrong. Like, there's no shades of gray. It's just they're just selfish, and they're just taking everything for themselves. So I did struggle a little bit with that, but I'm like, whatever works to propel our characters forward, because I am here for the character moments and them grappling with the morality of the decisions they have to make.
Comment on the Davidians, I felt the same way as well about them. I was happy they brought them back because we only saw them in Time's Arrow. But I think they were more of a swarm adversary. And so they didn't really have, aside from the first novel in which they had a bigger role, the last 2 novels, they were more of a swarm adversary. So they didn't really have like a spokesperson or some sort of memorable character from that, like a Borg Queen or a Khan or someone that more of an individualized character. So it was that type of enemy. So they were more just having a lot of them, and they were tough to defeat. So, but they were, like you said, they were still good and they were very threatening. I also thought that because they went that way with the Davidians, that's where the crazy Riker, the Admiral Riker, came in, because he could be someone that we know very well, but someone who's more of maybe not an adversary because he was thinking he was doing the right thing, but someone that had adversarial actions against Picard. So he was more like the foil or the antagonist. So I think because they went that way with the Davidians, they kind of had Admiral Riker play someone who was putting up the hurdles and the roadblocks for our heroes to overcome over the course of, especially the last 2 novels when he was, in focus. So.
Right. And Worf had been experiencing that too a little bit in the first book. So it was interesting to see how Worf was dealing with this versus how Riker ended up having it take over him completely, and Troy picking up that something wasn't right. But Riker wasn't really Riker. It wasn't just that he didn't want to undo the timeline, or because we see at the end he comes to himself and he's redeemed, right? But I think that with Riker, it was almost like he was possessed by a previous version of himself, right? Which is an interesting concept that would be interesting to see in Star Trek. Unfortunately, copyrights and money usually prevent us from seeing lit-verse things cross over into on-screen, but how interesting would it be to see a Riker or a Picard or a Beverly who's from another timeline burst onto the scene and bring a new perspective or go head to head. And I do think that Riker here was just too much of a foil, not enough of the Riker we know and love, because of we didn't really have a voice for we had a voice for the Davidians, but it wasn't compelling enough. So we had to create more personal
ended up being Riker's role in the trilogy for pretty much for most of the time. And then for the next section, we went to the mirror universe. So in the mirror universe, Picard made the case against the, I think it's called the Galactic Commonwealth, which I guess is the equivalent of the Federation in the mirror universe, to get their help and to explain what the problem is. Wesley, Geordi, and Data summarize what was causing the crisis. So it turns out that it wasn't the Davidians that caused the crisis. It was caused by the actions of Captain Picard and the Enterprise from First Contact. So they created a stable quantum branching timeline, which is the Borg timeline that started in First Contact. And they also created a unstable timeline, which was referred to as the first splinter. And as Data said, they are the first splinter. So the realization is that the post-Nemesis Litverse is the first splinter. So that was the revelation of what.
Dun dun dun.
And cue the music and cut the commercials, I think.
Yes. Cue the original TOS Amok Time prompts.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was following along, but I didn't understand everything that was going on until that scene, and then realized that, oh, there's all these different timelines, but then the fact that they caused it themselves through it, and they didn't realize it, of course, during First Contact, but that helped bring things close to home because they are the first splinter. That's when I realized that it's two different timelines, two different universes, and we've been reading everything that's been happening in the first splinter while we've been watching what's been happening in the prime timeline, and they're not really the same anymore. So that was my reactions when I was reading that section.
Yeah, and it's very meta because, again, I know that the authors have all talked about this, all three of them really, but David Mack's been pretty vocal about how they had brought this idea to him and the other authors, and they were talking about what was really, it was Picard season 1 that had prompted all of this. So we're looking at, okay, what do we do with this Litverse? Do we just leave it? Do we move on? And I think that this revealed that they're, a splinter, and that this is not the prime timeline is just a necessity of the story because they were asked to end the Litverse, and you can't end the prime timeline, and you can't reconcile the Litverse really with what's going on screen anymore. So yeah, that was a big moment in the book, but one that I kind of anticipated would come. I did not understand everything going on in this book, believe me. This was the timey-wiminess of this. I give David Mack all the credit. I was not great at science in high school. As a matter of fact, Star Trek helped me pass science in 9th grade because my earth science teacher loved Star Trek and would put like bonus questions on the tests. So it really, yeah. So I wish I was better at math and science than I ended up being in high school. But I think that the gut punch of that is that they created this themselves. And it wasn't, the Davidians took advantage of it, but they were the ones that had caused all these other timelines that the Davidians were feeding off of. So that was, I thought, a really big reveal. And also, they brought the Borg back, which is always a formidable opponent. Right. So you know that you're going to have one more standoff with the Queen, right? You know Picard's going to have to face this one more time, despite everything that happened in Destiny.
Yeah, that's a good summary. I think bringing the Borg back is going to be another challenge and one of Picard's biggest fears, which actually was touched on more recently in season 1. I remember with 7 of 9. I actually kind of like the Borg. That's one of my favorite Star Trek adversaries, those favorite villains. I know, especially the early Borg, the early TNG Borg, and the Best of Both Worlds, and the Q Who. It was nice to bring them back. So now that the revelation has been made, there's the next phase of the mission, which is actually splitting into 4 teams. So Picard and Sisko would be going to face the Borg in the alternate future timeline that was created during First Contact. Mirror Picard will be going back to the first splinter timeline to find the Davidians' intertime base of operations. Also, Mira Ezri and and first Splinter Kira would be creating a temporal bridge using the Orb of Time. So they would stay in the mirror universe, and they're going to be using the mirror time to sort of connect the two events from what Picard and Cisco will be doing on the Borg timeline and what Mirror Picard will be doing at the Davidians' intertime timeline or location. And then on the fourth team, it's Spock and Mirror Savick. They are going to go to Parliament to get permission from the Commonwealth to get more resources to help with the missions because they have the John ships, a very advanced version of a starship. So they have these John ships. And so Spock and Mirror Savick will be going there. So it ended up becoming, like you said, Michelle, it ended up being almost like an Avengers Endgame in which they had different teams going to different places, going into different universes, different times too, and then have a connecting thread that complete the mission successfully.
It's so hard to keep track of this. I mean, we need David Mack here to just, that meme, that GIF where they're pointing at all the different things on the map. That's literally how I feel right now because I get confused. I feel like I'm looking at a map with a million strings on it. And I really value all the hard work you've done here, Peter, because this is some major heavy lifting.
I mentioned this on Twitter. It's like, this is the first novel which I've read and which I've had to use a spreadsheet to help me keep track.
You need good spreadsheets for Coda, I tell you. They did a great job with these books, too. I have to give props to all the authors for the timeline in the beginning. For those of us who may not have read all the novels, such as the fact that Janeway died and was resurrected by Q, I think. Like, little things like that. The Data was resurrected in a way, and Lal is in this, and I loved the Data Lal scenes, and I had no idea that Data was back in the Litverse because I hadn't gotten that far or really read those books yet, and when I first read this. So it's interesting to see how much care they took to catch up the reader so that you could jump into this even if you felt overwhelmed by the Litverse, because you were going to be overwhelmed by the storyline, because as you could see, everybody's everywhere all at once. Is that everything everywhere all at once? But yes, I think that having these teams allowed us to kind of jump around a bit and also get those character moments that we really wanted with certain people together. So that was nice.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk about that because in a way, the second half of the novel is really focused on like a lot of the pairings or the goodbyes and the character scenes between different team members as they come to a head and they start realizing, they will have to end this universe in order to save the Prime One. So what did you think, Michelle? There were a lot of different scenes and between the different characters. Which one stood out to you, very memorable as in those scenes?
Well, I mean, Spock, of course. As a TOS fan, it was great to see Spock in this story, and Mirror Savick. I am a fan of the TOS movies especially, and I actually love Star Trek 3, and I love the bond between Spock and Savick, and I was glad to see it was explored in the novels. This is Mirror Savick, but I appreciated their contribution. It wasn't as big as I hoped it would be, but again, lovely to see Spock in anything, really. He was, and how it bookended with Leonard Nimoy at the end of the novel too. So with that quote, last tweet, which we'll get to at the end. But I also enjoyed, of course, the pairing of Picard and Beverly going together to that alternate Borg future and everything that happened there. Another pairing that I really enjoyed was Worf and Kalar, Mirror Kalar. I felt like that was something that was never really resolved with Worf and his son Alexander being there. I love that this novel brought them back together because I did feel like Kalar was the best for Worf. I love Jadzia though. Having seen DS9, I miss Jadzia Dax, and I think she was amazing for Worf, but I loved the Kalar of it all and just thought they had some really nice scenes and bringing out Worf. And really, I think in the novels, Worf, it says, I can't remember where it was, but I think I read this in a review too. It's been so long, but Worf says something to the effect of, or it says that Worf is not afraid to die. He's afraid of failing his friends. And so that kind of sums him up, that he's doing this for his family. He's doing this for his friends. And Kalar, was very important to him, and they kind of just offed her in TNG because man pain, you know, fridging, not a great thing. But and also saddling him. Okay, well now Alexander, and we know that Worf and Alexander did not really hit it off well, and there's a lot of things talking about Worf as a father, and I think this novel addresses some of that and kind of brings that family back together, which I really loved. The final pairing, that's no surprise to anyone, is of course Jean-Luc and Beverly, Picard and Crusher. They are just going back to the Borg alternate future, so Back to the Future, I don't know. And they are, of course, with Sisko and Bashir, but I love the conversations that they have. There's a particularly poignant one where Beverly is questioning, what if we've made a mistake? What if Will is right? And he said, if there was the slightest chance, I would never stop fighting for it. And she tries to encourage him to fight for it. Like, Beverly is always looking for another way. She never gives up hope. And she knows what they're doing. They're about to erase everything that they've gone through, everything that they've built. And it's a very emotional scene. And she talks about Renee, and he says, I don't want to lose any part of our life, Beverly. Not you, not Renee, not Wesley, not our friends. But if there really are an infinity of possible timelines, I have to believe that ours isn't the only one in which we find each other. There must be countless realities where we get to watch Renee grow up in his own good time, an infinite number in which Data returns and brings Love back to life, endless dimensions in which the sacrifices we've made and all the good that we've done matter and are remembered. Our love will live on, Beverly promised herself. I don't know if I believe that, but I need to. So I will. It will. And I absolutely love that part of the book because, again, as a fan, it's a little meta, but it shows their relationship, how they bounce off each other, how they listen to each other, how they make each other better. And I love that they're pushing back on this as she would, because she never gives up. And Picard is saying, of course, I wouldn't give up either, but this is the hand we've been dealt. And Picard gives Beverly hope in this case. And it gives the reader hope too. So you see that theme, despite all the darkness, despite everything that happens, there are an infinite number of timelines possibly in Star Trek, and you never know what we can imagine. And that really is in the minds of every viewer is a timeline almost. So we have our own timelines. We have our own desires for each character or storyline or plot. And it kind of speaks to the audience there too.
And really great summary of that Picard Beverly conversation. I remember when I was reading that, that was one of the passages that hit me too, because they were questioning whether they were making the right choices, going on the right mission. Is this the right mission? So I think Beverly is playing the conscience of the team to say, take a step back, and is this the right thing to do?
Yeah. And I think it plays into Picard season 3 as well now as we're seeing that unfold. So we'll see if they find each other again.
I guess we'll know for sure in 5 or 6 weeks from now.
5 weeks. Yeah, here we go. Where we'll find out. But I definitely hope that they were a little inspired by David Mack, because he does have a big appreciation for their relationship, which I absolutely adore in these novels.
On a related note, I was thinking that with Picard season 2, there were some common themes between Coda and between season 2, because in Picard season 2, it was talking about Picard's background, his relationship with his mom. And I think Q said it at the beginning of something about this is the road not traveled. This is the path you did not take when you took this other path. So it reminded me a little bit of things that was going on in previous season Picard. So
Picard season 2 was timey-wimey like this for sure. And it was, I mean, you had an alternate future. You had kind of like the awful future, right? Of the Confederation and what would have happened had Renee Picard not gone into space and found whatever it was that she found that helped the Earth. And I can't quite remember what that was, but it was an important moment.
Yeah, it was like some type of bacteria or fungi or something.
It's interesting, though, because Picard season 2 was all hinging on Picard really healing those family wounds, like those emotional wounds. And it seems like in the Prime timeline, he didn't get to do that. It's interesting. I feel like Picard was more open in the lit verse, and I feel like that death in winter really opened him up to love in a way that he could commit to Beverly first, and then she convinced him to have a child. I don't necessarily think a child fixes everything. A child is not a fix for trauma, but I think Picard being a father helped. But I think it was first his love for Beverly coming first, and being open to that, and his in general just being more open after Data's death and the way Data's death affected him and the path that he chose after Nemesis versus the path that he chose maybe in the Prime timeline.
Because there was different novels, there's just different or more opportunities to really to explore his character and develop his character more and go down a different path with him, relationship with Beverly or deeper relationship with Beverly and Renee.
I try to rectify what was different in the lit verse versus what was different in the Prime timeline for Picard, because we'll get to David Mack later in his quotes, but I do think that Picard season 3, I have to see how it plays out, because it's interesting that Beverly left. He didn't seem interested in following her, getting married to her. And in the lit verse, Picard, we had Death in Winter, and he kind of came to his senses a bit because of that event. I don't think anything like that happened in the Prime timeline. It's easy to blame Beverly. I see a lot of people blaming Beverly for stealing fatherhood from Picard, and now he can't be the father that he was in the lit. Like he would have been, maybe he would have been more like the lit verse had he raised his son. And I think ultimately it might be because in the lit verse, his love for Beverly came first. It wasn't about marrying somebody out of obligation or duty because you have a child. It's more his love for Beverly. And
Yeah, that's what he felt.
right. And he let himself into that. Whereas in the Prime timeline, I think he was still very closed off, and it took Q changing the entire timeline to shock him into and again, I have my own opinions about how they executed this on the show, but that traumatic event and how that really affected him his whole life. And it was a very specific aim at his relationships. Guinan talks about it. Q talks about it, that he wasn't really able to love until he came to terms with this. And for some reason, that wasn't necessary in the lit verse. And it's just interesting to think about. I don't have an answer for it, but I try not to blame Beverly too much, because I feel like there's more going on, and she is my favorite character. So we'll see. I do love John Luke though, as well.
Yeah. Oh no, they're all great. Yeah, they're all great characters.
But this book powerfully exemplified their dynamic and the lit verse, why they could have worked, like why it could have all been different and how it could have all been different. And a lot of that was Picard stepping up, and a lot of that was Beverly being open to it as well.
For me, there were several of the pairings that were memorable. One was Geordi and Data. Geordi and Data are one of my favorite friendships within Star Trek. So it was sad when Geordi and Data were communicating. They weren't physically together, but they were communicating, so they were in different locations. But having that conversation in which Geordi and Data admitted that they probably won't be seeing each other, and that Data said, like, I love you at the end, and Geordi was crying and in tears. So that was one of the ones that I enjoyed, or maybe not enjoyed, but that was memorable for me.
I love that pairing. They are, I mean, we just did the episode. It's probably not going to come out for a while. We just did the episode Clues on Crusher Convo. And we talk about that a little bit, because it is Geordi who's looking at Data there and being very frank and honest with him. And Geordi was Data's best friend and vice versa. So I always took a little issue too with Star Trek Picard ending Data's story arc without Geordi. It felt a little hollow. I'm interested to see what season 3 is going to bring to that. But I do think that that's a beautiful, I absolutely agree with you. It was great. It was done very well in the books, because I think they had a falling out in the novels.
I think so, yeah, and I think they alluded to that a little bit. I didn't read that specific novel when they did have the falling out, but in their final conversation together, Geordi did allude to that. So, and then another one that I was sad to read and was affected by it was with Sisko and Bashir. So when they were in the Borg timeline and then they were able to rescue Picard, Sisko was mortally wounded, and then Bashir was next to him. So here's a passage from the scene between Sisko and Bashir. Bashir leaned closer to Cisco and continued in a faltering voice. I don't see the point anymore. Death is universal, inescapable, inevitable. Everything is doomed to entropy and oblivion. Even time itself is going to die, so why bother now? Why go on fighting? Cisco's eyes dimmed. A life only has meaning when we make it mean something. He summoned the strength to grant Bashir a smile, so go make ours mean something. More tears fell from Bashir's eyes onto his and Cisco's clasped hands. He did his best to reciprocate Cisco's encouraging smile. Yes, sir. Julian, call me Ben. Cisco's eyes fluttered closed as he let go of his final breath. Bashir reverently folded the captain's hands atop his chest. Benjamin Lafayette Cisco, decorated Starfleet officer, Bajor's revered emissary of the prophets, and Julian Bashir's brother-in-arms, was dead. Yeah, that one affected me more. DS9 is my favorite Star Trek, though. So just reading scenes with Cisco and then later with Bashir and then with Kira, I was affected by it. But this one hit me as well because of his passing.
I love how they're trying to, the meaning of it all, right? Cisco is trying to give Bashir some hope there. It kind of dovetails nicely with what Picard had said earlier with Beverly, part that I didn't read, where he says, each of us owes the universe a death, Beverly. Ours have come due, but we have a chance to make them mean something, to spare an infinity of possibilities from sharing our fate. It's always needs of the many versus the needs of the few and the one. And I think with Cisco there, that's a great parallel to the theme. And also just, it's Cisco. This is the man that's been fighting. I mean, he's been through so much. He's been with the prophets, Jake's father. Like, he's a dad. And having come at this through the lens of DS9, now I've seen it. It certainly can see that when he says, call me Ben. I mean, because Cisco and Bashir didn't always get along, They were good friends, though. But I appreciate more now the captaincy and the character of Benjamin Sisko, having now seen DS9, and I wish we could get him back somehow.
It would be great if they bring Avery Brooks back. Remember Picard Season 2 had a quick Easter egg with General Cisco, I think. And the comics, actually, I don't know if you read the comics, but the comics that they've restarted recently have Captain Cisco back and then be the captain of the USS Theseus and, going on a mission. I'm actually starting to read Star Trek comics, and Captain Cisco is one of the lead character in the flagship comic.
Great. As a kid, I was a big fan of the TOS comics, and I used to collect them. So I used to ride my bike down to the comic store down a busy road. My dad hated me doing that, but I actually bought like a TNG card set that I still have. I don't know why I bought it. I wasn't a big TNG fan, but I just liked I felt like I'm a Star Trek fan. I wanted to get it, but I did get a bunch of comics from the original series. But now I have read certain IDW comics. I know they did a Picard prequel to season 3 that I read. I know there was IDW comics coming out before Picard season 1 that I read. And there was one with Jack Crusher, an IDW comic about their Beverly and Picard's first meeting and Jack Crusher on the Stargazer. It's kind of funny, and also like I could totally see this happening on screen. So it's a nice little fill in the blank. So comics are a great way to engage in this fandom. I've heard about the Ben Sisko ones, but I haven't had a chance to pick them up. To be honest, I just want to see how Picard season 3 plays out, and then I'll be interested to maybe go back and check out some of the other media that's involved.
I think it's great. I think I'm kind of picking up comics just to add some additional stories and read some more Star Trek, and never could go wrong with that.
I do love how Terry Matalas keeps joking about like, oh, we're going to have a 12-page spread on insert ridiculous question fan has here. It's just, yeah, don't worry. You didn't figure that out. There'll be a 12-issue IDW comic on it. We'll explain about, I don't know. I can't think of the most ridiculous thing we've seen. Everything's been pretty much explained on season 3 of Picard, so I haven't had any complaints, but some fans are asking questions about like the lighting and stuff. Like there'll be a 12-part series on why the starships are so dark on the bridge, which honestly I come on neither side of that debate. If you don't like it, that's fine. If you do, I understand people have trouble seeing, like visually. Some people are visually impaired, so it might be an issue. But also this is how we tell stories now,
Yeah, I think it's the nature of the shows these days, or the technology, or the style.
And the direction. We're not this is not the 80s. We're not like bright lights
Yeah.
and carpet anymore. And
Yeah.
you know,
Yes.
I don't want to get into that debate, but
Enterprise D. Enterprise D. Yeah.
yes, this is the wonderful nature of the novels is you can just imagine it in your head.
Well, that's really the best part. I think that's why I enjoy reading the novels. I'm glad I rediscovered them because it is your imagination fills in the blanks. So another pairing that I enjoyed reading about was the Data Law pairing, like you've mentioned before. A fan of Data and Law from The Offspring, and was sad to see Law go in the show. So I was glad that they brought her back, and then having her play Data's conscience in this story. So she was the one who Data to help the crew. I think this was more in book 2. So I was sad to see her scenes as well, but that was another one that was very well done.
I love the Data Law stuff. I think I mentioned it before, and it was nice to see that loop closed in a different way. We got Soji in Picard season 1, who I love, by the way, and I wish was in season 3. And here we have Lal back, and fatherhood of Data, parenthood of Data, and just their relationship. The Offspring is one of my favorite TNG episodes. And just so heartbreaking. So, and I think that Bashir actually, does he die defending Data and Lal?
Yes, Data, Lal, and Bashir were the last members of that team still in the planet. They were the last ones because everybody else left, like Picard and Beverly and Worf. So Bashir died when the Borg were swarming.
Because I gotta admit, when I watched DS9, Julian Bashir, I usually love the Doctors. He was not my favorite character to start for certain reasons.
He did have a rough season 1, I admit. This character at the beginning wasn't that great. Yeah.
Yeah, but even through, I think Bashir grew on me over time, and to have him in the Litverse go out as a hero protecting Data and Lal was pretty epic.
During the Trek Book Club discussion, David Mack tweeted out a follow-up to our discussion related to Cisco and Bashir's scene. This was Bashir's Dark Night of the Soul, in a classic All Is Lost moment. He has been through hell for his Section 31 story arc. This moment of grace from Cisco is his absolution. It's how he goes on. And so that's from Mr. Mack.
I love that quote, and I think it ties in nicely to what you were saying about that last scene with Cisco and Bashir as well. You're having these meaningful moments for DS9 in this novel, even though it's a heavy TNG emphasis too. I think that for Bashir, he dies with a smile on his face, and I could see that smile. I do love the way he goes out, for sure. I'm sad to lose him, but we were losing everybody anyway. So to at least give them a character moment was really nice.
I was still hoping at the early part of this novel that they could save everything, and including themselves. But I still had hope.
You had hope?
Yeah, I know my
Oh, Peter, I'm sorry.
So I was like, they could do it, But,
No, listen, I wish I could have that outlook. I'm always cautiously optimistic, but the way they were promoting this, I just didn't see a way out.
Yeah, and I think once it got to this point, everybody was having their scene. Actually, what did you think about the Borg? We had one last visit with the Borg, a different Borg queen, but someone who did remember Locutus of Borg. So did you like that part of the story of them bringing them back?
It's interesting because I know a lot of fans, and I know David Mack was ready to put the Borg storyline to bed, like we've mined as much as we can from the Borg. I don't know if that was necessarily true, and I love the way they tied the Borg into this, especially with First Contact. I appreciated Picard having to face off one last time with his ultimate enemy. And really, it's such a personal enemy for him because they violated him in a very deep way that affects him in the Prime timeline to this day. Like we just saw an episode the other week where just the pain that this man goes through because of Wolf 359 and everything. So I thought it was very appropriate also for Beverly's character arc too, for her to have a moment, a heroic moment, a moment where she stands up and she risks her life for the man she loves, the person she loves, and she goes, and that famous line, it's right where he's confronting the Borg Queen. The Borg Queen has him, and it's really terrifying because you think Picard is going to die in the grips of the Borg Queen. That is not the way we want Jean-Luc Picard to go out. But Beverly convinces Cisco and Bashir to go back right? And it really leads to Cisco's death, which is very sad. But Beverly says, I'll go alone. Like you get, and they weren't going to let her go alone. So that, again, the Starfleet camaraderie, also the respect for Jean-Luc Picard. But Picard is trying to fight the Borg Queen. He's attempting to outmatch her, but she's getting the upper hand. And then all of a sudden, Beverly Crusher stepped out of the shadows behind Picard, her rifle braced against her shoulder, its muzzle aimed at the twitching Queen. Tell me if this hurts. Our next shot lasted several seconds. Oh, yeah. And then it was like, I mean, you can kind of see in Picard season 3, everybody's like, oh, Beverly Crusher, all of a sudden. It's like, no, not all of a sudden. This is who she is. She fired a weapon many times in TNG and in the movies. Insurrection, Suspicions. I could name off a ton of times that Beverly Crusher rocked it, but I love what David Mack gave her here. She took out the Borg Queen. She saved Picard's life. And of course, she asked, Jean-Luc, are you all right? And he says, no, most certainly not. They're in the middle of this universe-ending plot where they're going to have to kill everything and everybody. And yet Jean-Luc is still like, there's still that kind of back and forth banter between them. She just saved his life from the Borg Queen. And that's his reply. But she slings the rifle over her shoulder and pulls out her medical tricorder to assess Picard. It's just it's what you want to see on screen, right? Mm-hmm. And we kind of do see that in episode 1 of Picard season 3, and it's not out of character. This is what she does to protect the people that she loves, protecting a different Picard, as far as we know. So I did love that. How did you feel about the Borg in this book?
The Borg is one of my favorite Star Trek adversaries, so I didn't mind that they brought the Borg back. Having a more dangerous and a more threatening Borg, having a Borg in which they control that particular timeline. They took over Earth, they made Earth a Borg planet, so they were powerful.
Yeah, they were living it up. Yeah.
Yeah, this is it. So we had a slight peek of that in First Contact before the Enterprise warped back in time. So this is a more dangerous Borg. So I enjoyed it. Once I realized that the Borg are coming back and they have to go into the belly of the beast to continue their mission, I said, oh, this is going to be another challenge especially for Picard, given his history with them. So then the next section, the last section, is really the final battle and whole climax. So and it's not just the climax of the book, but we're also talking about the climax of the trilogy. And you could also say it's the climax of the last 20 years of the Litverse. So Riker is back to normal. So he's helping out. They're attacking the Davidian base. Wesley is helping out. And then he had also a farewell scene with Beverly as well. Another very good one for both of them.
Here's what I love about the final battle. It is Star Trek at its finest. It is teamwork. It is all different characters from different series working together. You've got Kira, you've got Data and Lal, you've got Picard and Beverly, you've got Bashir, you've got all of these different, you have Wesley is leading the pack, and
yeah, Kira and Mira Dax was helping out, on the other side as well.
So you have all of these components working together. And yes, Wesley does have a goodbye scene, and it is heartbreaking. What did you think of it?
Yes, I was reading up on the Beverly Wesley scene, and here's a section of it. Her firstborn son, her baby, her miraculous child, who had grown into a being more remarkable than she had ever imagined possible, was gone.
Well, that kind of punches you in the gut right there.
Wesley was able to communicate with Beverly briefly.
Well, with Renee, it's interesting because it's Renee that says, so Renee hears Wesley, I think. Wesley is communicating with both of them. Renee picks up on it and he says, Mom, listen. And they can feel him. Like they can feel him continuing. And I guess because he's a traveler and there's so many timelines he exists in, and they all do, right? But maybe, again, it's that temporal moving on. And I love that it's Renee who has struggled with being in the shadow of his brother Wesley, who's so special, who points out when he's with Mira Luke in this series, where Mira Luke is taking on that responsibility that he's thinking about. First of all, Luke was smitten by Beverly Crusher, this one, and Wesley points it out. And then he feels this tremendous responsibility to Renee and trying to bring Renee to an understanding of his brother. He kind of feels jealous of Wesley. It's very interesting. And I think Renee has finally come to terms with it here. And he even had that part where Wesley tries to kind of age him up in wisdom. They try to like do the mind link a little bit. But Renee here has finally come to connect with his brother, I think, and resolve that maybe tension that they had at the beginning of these novels. And Beverly, I mean, just despairing. She's lost a child, right? And she's about to lose another one and everything that's happening. And yet Renee brings them back to this moment. It kind of reminds me of the end of the book where they mentioned Baku and that whole like live in this moment, be in this moment. I feel like that rang true in that scene. A very powerful scene. And the character Beverly Crusher in this book, she's just so fierce. Even before she lost Wesley, she was fighting beside Picard. And there was a line here. It said, Crusher unleashed hell, though she knew it wouldn't matter how many Nagus or avatars the strike team killed. The enemy would never relent, never surrender. The strike team couldn't possibly hold the core for more than a few minutes. What did matter now was that she spent her final moments bravely and well. For her husband and her sons, Beverly Crusher vowed to do exactly that. And that is who Beverly Crusher is in any timeline, in my opinion. And I think that we are seeing that in Picard season 3. But I love what David Mack did here with Beverly Crusher. And yes, losing Wesley in that moment, but still, again, having that turn of hope was really important.
There were so many of these memorable scenes. It was like one right after the other during that last half of the book. And this was another one.
Knockout punch after knockout punch.
Yeah, it's like, keep on going. I was like reading this every few pages. That was another emotional one. So
Worf and Kalar, right?
yeah, at the end.
And Alexander.
Alexander, they were together and they were in the battle. Yeah.
Fighting side by side, like Picard, Renee, and Beverly. And you had Data and Lal.
Yeah. Yeah. So there was just a lot. And Riker and Deanna.
You know, and then Riker and Deanna. I mean, I'm sure we're going to get to all this.
Towards the end, this is with the Titan, with Deanna and Natasha was on the Titan. Riker was on the Davidian Intertime.
Right, their daughter in the novels was Natasha, right?
Yeah. Their daughter in the novel is Natasha's. So yeah, so they were communicating. It was through the mind link telepathically. The Titan was crashing into the Davidian complex. And then so Deanna and Natasha was talking to Riker at that time. And Deanna died through there. And then Riker realized what was happening, but then he was also defending Picard from the Davidians. So it was that scene, but they were saying their farewells, knowing what was coming. This was next to last scene of the climax. So yeah, but that's another one.
So many angsty goodbyes. It's just the end of this book is such a gut punch.
It is very memorable. For me, it stood out as that I enjoyed it. It's because of all these, even though it was hard to read. Pretty much all of them were hard to read because they were so emotional farewells then.
Yeah, and I love, because you have here about that very last moment where it really all comes down to Picard, because honestly, the post-Nemesis timeline, a lot of that is hinged on Picard. So you have a scene where he's holding Renee and Beverly, and it's really down to them, and he's got the button that he has to press. And you know who has the last line in this novel? In this universe, in this Splinter timeline, it's Beverly Crusher. And crying Crusher embraced Picard and their son. Do it. She told him to do it.
Yeah.
And he did it. And death rained down. And that is the most powerful part of this novel. And to me, the powerful link between Picard and Beverly. Like, they give each other strength to do the hardest thing. And to have them holding each other like that and to be fighting the Nagus, again, it reminds me of something that was in a preview for Picard season 3, where you kind of see a similar scene of them fighting as a family. And it's kind of what we wanted to see. So we're seeing it in a different way on screen, but this was incredibly moving.
Remember that it was Kira and Mirror Dax that was having problems with their part of it, and they were delayed. And so everybody was waiting for Kira to, hit the button or do something with the Orb of Time. So that I remember that was a tense little segment there. Now that Picard, with Beverly's encouragement, sort of hit the button, we moved to chapter 40, which is a interesting one. I think it was more like the literary equivalent of almost like a montage of having Picard experience all these different timelines. Some timelines we saw or we've heard about over the years, and then there's some timelines we did not hear about, different situations, or as Q said in Picard season 2, the road not taken. So it's kind of like a way of almost recapping Picard's life, but also starting that transition from the first Splinter, that is the Litverse, into the prime timeline Picard, that is the beginning of what we saw in the beginning of Picard season 1 and in the last Best Hope novel. So that was that chapter 40.
I mean, you kind of take us through it, but the highlights of, again, seeing Picard in his alternate timelines from being an archaeologist instead of a Starfleet officer. You see the birth of Renee here, or the birth of his son comes up here with Beverly goes, "Go on, Jean-Luc, hold him." And Picard is still trembling from the emotional ordeal of witnessing Beverly Crusher giving birth to their son. Something we really didn't see in the novels. It was nice to keep that scene in there. Mm-hmm. And then you have tapestry reference, which was very powerful.
One of my favorite episodes. There was also, I remember one, he wins the Academy Marathon, which was mentioned in, I think it was in Best of Both Worlds. You actually see a little scene about that. End of Generations, in which Picard and Riker was on the Enterprise D, on the planet, on the Saucer section was there. Date of Sacrifice at the end of Nemesis was touched on. And also, I think the birth of Thad with Will and Deanna, that was also a quick scene that he was there. So all these different scenes was interesting to see.
The flashback to his father when he was a boy,
yeah,
you know?
Yeah, that was another one. And then,
which kind of was a foreshadowing maybe of Picard season 2 a little bit. And pretty much landing in the prime timeline. And that really was what made me end on a positive note with this novel and gave me a little hope, was that you could tell that we are moving to this Picard, the first Splinter Picard, the literary Picard, is moving through the different Picards and different timelines, and he lands and he ends in our Jean-Luc, right? The Jean-Luc that did not marry Beverly Crusher and did not have a son, that did not do all these other amazing things like in Destiny with the Borg and all of these character developments that he had through the Litverse. Obviously, it's much more than just his relationship with Beverly, but I think that, again, for me, it was knowing that at least a small part of it, the alternate Picard, the other timeline Picard, it kind of lives inside Jean-Luc in some way.
Yeah. Even though it may not have been the original intention maybe of the authors, but I think between what we see in Picard season 2 and season 3, between his relationship with his father and mom, that was the focus of season 2, and now the relationship with Beverly and seeing what's going to happen over the rest of the next few episodes. The literary Picard seems to have an effect on the one that we're seeing now. So
we can headcanon that our beloved Jean-Luc from the Litverse is influencing Picard in season 3, I think. I do love that where it lands. I will say I'm not a fan of Anij and Insurrection, so I was a little salty that was kind of how it ended with Anij. I'm like, come on, we all love Beverly and we got to end on Anij. I understand that she had a nice philosophical point with that whole slowing down and experiencing the moment to find your forever in this moment. It's an important character arc. It's an important story arc. And that's why David Mack landed on it in the literary sense. But it's okay. I love the way that it wrapped up. I'm sad that they erased the Litverse, but I just didn't see it ending any other way in my head based on what was going on in the real world, like meta.
I felt the same way. Like I said earlier, even though I haven't read a lot of the book, I was hoping for keeping the two still alive in some way, but I also understand the decisions that they made, and it's okay, and it's fine, and that's the direction that they're going with this. So
you've come to terms with it a lot better than me, Peter, I will tell you. I'm getting there. Season 3 is getting me there, but I'm trying.
And then the last section, and it's more of like an epilogue, is the Grace Notes, in which we have an appearance by Benny Russell, who is the character that Captain Sisko played in Far Beyond the Stars, one of the highly regarded DS9 episodes.
Wonderful episode.
Yeah, it's really great. One of my favorites, top 5 for sure. We see that Benny was the author of the Liveverse. And so we saw Benny typing up the words that ends the previous chapter. And then we would see Benny start writing the first few words of the Last Best Hope book. So it's like a transition between the Liveverse and Picard. So it's really making that connection. So this was also interesting because I don't know if our listeners know, but at the end of DS9, when they were planning how to end the show, there was an initial thought of having the show be a figment of Benny Russell's imagination from Far Beyond the Stars. I personally am glad they did not go down that route and they went down the route we saw on the show. But it also reminded me of that because in here, Benny Russell did play the role that he was initially thought of to play for DS9.
Yeah, for sure. I think it was an interesting little Easter egg, maybe. It's funny to think that the entire Litverse was written by Benny Russell. I don't love that idea. It's kind of like when Enterprise ended, and I actually have never seen Enterprise, but I know everybody hates the ending. No, I haven't seen it yet, and I know a little hesitant because of the reviews, but I hear it's really good and like it gets better, but I hear the ending is terrible. Although Riker and Troy, I'm like, how could you go wrong with Riker and Troy? But for them to come out of the holodeck and say that they were just watching it on the holodeck, not loving that. I could understand why fans would be upset. I think it's maybe a nice little nod. I choose to just kind of look at it as, oh yeah, that was a great episode, nice little homage. I do love they connect it to The Last Best Hope, which is interesting. Although even some of the things in Last Best Hope may be getting a little, I don't want to say retconned, but reimagined in season 3 of Picard, because Beverly Crusher was certainly in a different place.
That's how the book ended. The next thing I wanted to mention was actually the quote, the Leonard Nimoy ending quote. Leonard Nimoy's last tweet from February 23rd, 2015. A life is like a garden. Perfect moments can be had, but not preserved except in memory. Live long and prosper. For me, I kind of felt that was an appropriate thing of everything that the team did, in which, except for maybe the prophets, didn't remember that they did it, but then they self-sacrifice, in which they gave up themselves and sacrificed their timeline to keep the prime timeline going.
A beautiful quote by Leonard Nimoy. It reminds me of the quote from Picard in The Inner Light. In Inner Light, there's a really great parallel with Picard because he's on a planet that's dying. And this quote ties into what Leonard Nimoy was saying a little bit, maybe, and what the authors are maybe trying to say. Live now. Make now always the most precious time. Now will never come again. And I think that's really part of what they're saying. And also things are preserved. I like to think that there's a little bit more hope in the end of this novel, that it does go on, it maybe in a completely different way. And there is tragedy. I mean, that's life, right? Like I know David Mack has discussed that I believe he had lost his mother during the writing of this novel. And I think that definitely reflects here and is very moving. That loss, that emptiness, that feeling that how can this get better? What can make it better? Nothing can make it better, but we go on and there is hope even in the darkest moments.
David Mack in the Trek Book Club discussion, as part of that discussion on Leonard Nimoy's quote, he also chimed in following. For me, it evokes the Buddhist notion that there is no constant in life except change. We can't hold on to the present moment. It is always slipping into the past as we move into the future. It also echoes what Anij said to Picard about perfect moments in Star Trek Insurrection. So yeah, kind of echoing what you said as well, and what Picard said in The Inner Light. Nothing is fixed or permanent. Everything is change. Yeah, so that's Oblivion's Gate.
Yes, and hopefully, I know David Mack has had some interesting comments, and he really is, again, one of the prime authors of the Trek Litverse and worked so hard on it. So I felt so badly that he had to kind of torpedo it all. But I do appreciate his love for Beverly Crusher in particular in these novels. And he did have a quote one of the quotes that you had pointed out to me that I think he made over that discussion weekend about Oblivion's Gate that you had done through Trek Book Club was, he said, I've always felt like Beverly Crusher was never given enough room to really shine on TNG or in the movies. And I always thought it was a mistake not to let her and Picard be together. In the books, we think of her as Picard's touchstone, his North Star of purpose and inspiration. And he kind of said the same thing in a tweet before season 3, where he said, I think one of our key conceits, literary continuity of the last 20 years, is that Dr. Crusher is Picard's touchstone, his moral and emotional compass. So I think that this is what helped my enjoyment of the book. And I know he's also had a playlist he put out. He has a couple of playlists for this book, which is really cool. They're on Spotify. So look up David Mack's Spotify playlist because he has them for a few different works that he's done. But he has reading music for Star Trek Coda. And he also has a contemporary song list, things that inspired certain moments of Coda and or helped kind of when he was writing certain moments of Coda. But for Beverly Crusher, I asked him, well, what song or what had been your inspiration? And David Mack talked about The Strength of Egyptians from the His Dark Materials soundtrack. And it is a powerful instrumental piece that I think embodies Beverly Crusher and her heroics and also the stakes of the situation. And definitely give that a listen, but definitely give his other playlist a listen as well, because he has some great contemporary music that inspired him. It's called his Big Mood Oblivion's Gate playlist. It's got like Billy Joel on it. It's got Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, Queen, Rush, Louis Armstrong, John Lennon, Jim Croce, The Doors. Like, I love this playlist. So go check David Mack out on Spotify and on Twitter. A great Trek author.
He's really good. Like I said, I really enjoyed his Destiny novels. I've read his Cold Equations trilogy as well. And then reading his books here. And I also want to thank Dayton Ward and James Swallow. The way they talked about creating the Coda trilogy, all of the 3 authors was involved in all the 3 books. So there was a team. I mean, everyone had their focus. So everyone sort of wrote their book, but they were involved in it as a team. So I think it was Dayton Ward who had the idea of using the First Contact as the inflection point to where the timeline got branched off.
I love hearing how they met like at a barbecue and we're talking about this, you know? And you said Dayton Ward came up with a piece as well?
Yeah, Dayton Ward came up with using the First Contact and as the inflection point. I think it was James Swallow who came up with the role of Riker and being the antagonist.
It's a controversial part of the book, but I think it's what made it have more emotional impact at the end when he realizes, and you had to have some sort of antagonist that had a personal stake in it, and that would make it feel like almost a betrayal and a really versus thing. I'd be interested to hear, again, it's copyright, it's money, you can't really say they inspired anything, but I'm interested to see if Terry Matalas actually had any inspiration from any of these novels, because I feel like there is, and I love that. Like, inspiration, it's not, you don't need like copyright and money to, we get into that with you can't use characters from the novels on screen because of certain things, and we got that even from Trek to Trek, where Tom Paris was Nick Locarno, yeah. But I do feel like there is a little bit of a vibe, a little bit of a tribute to the post-Nemesis lit verse in Picard season 3. I don't know if that's intentional or not. He has a whole writing staff too, so I don't know if any of them had really felt it. I know David Mack has consulted on Prodigy, so he is still in the Trek universe and everything, which is cool. And I would have loved to see what he would have done with Star Trek Picard. That would have been interesting on screen, but yeah, props to all the writers. And Terry Matalas is a big fan as well. And he's a big fan of Beverly Crusher and has been very vocal of her. So his support of her, just like David Mack has. So that is pleasing to us Beverly Crusher fans. But the actual Coda trilogy, I give so much props to all the authors on that.
Very well said. Really a great job. It's controversial. There's still a gamut of reactions to what happened and what was read. Either way, it's the end is like a transition point between the Litverse and what it is now. So I think I would be interested in to see how the Star Trek novels proceed. We've had a few Picard novels. We've had There's a Strange New Worlds, even though it's a different era, New Worlds novel. We had a few Discovery novels, even though that's also in a different era. So also, it's not as many releases, at least in the last year, compared to what it was in years past.
Right. Well, they're really contending with on-screen things as well and trying not to step over those things because they're still in development. So it must be tricky. Like the Titan novel was cool with Thad,
The Dark
which makes
Veil,
it
yeah,
even more heartbreaking in
yeah.
Picard
Mhm.
season 1. Yeah. So there's still novels out there to enjoy that are in the prime timeline, or at least until something else happens. It does make it harder for fans to invest in the literature, but again, going in that's what's on screen will always supersede whatever's written. So it was just that we never thought that we would get this crew back together, and now we've been given the gift of that with Picard season 3. So I think hopefully that will help those fans that kind of maybe have a bad taste in their mouth with the Litverse brace Picard season 3 a little bit and see what the future of Star Trek has. Because I can see why they're like, well, did you have to just obliterate it? But I also feel there was hope at the end, and I think they're doing some wonderful things on screen right now that I always wanted to see a lot of the Litverse on screen. And we're getting maybe a hint of that.
Season 3 has really been, very positively accepted, positive feedback from the fans. So it's the end of Picard, but hopefully talk of spin-offs or continuation series. I mean, unfortunately, on the flip side, I do know recent news about Discovery ending with season 5, Paramount Plus not renewing for additional season. And I think in streaming services in general,
Yeah,
having
that's true.
the financial challenges of just trying to be profitable. So we'll have to see what happens and what the future of Star Trek is going to be.
Yeah, that is sad about Discovery, but maybe that opens up the Litverse for Discovery now. Yeah, it is a reality of the streaming universe and what's going to happen to shows. How many seasons will they get? And, I look forward to the last season of Discovery and seeing what they're going to give us.
We'll see in 2024 is when season 5 dropped. So, in closing, thank you very much, Michelle. It's really been great talking to you. I'm really looking forward to talking about Oblivion Engage for a long time. So I'm glad we were able to have this conversation. So I really thank you for your time and all the insightful comments and thoughts you had about Coda, Star Trek, Beverly, all of the above. So
Well, I hope they were insightful. Sorry about the Beverly overload, maybe, but she deserves some time. So thank you for having it on here.
very well deserved. So thank you. Can you just tell us contact information, any projects or podcasts that you're working on that you want to share with our listeners?
Of course. So I mentioned it at the top, at Crusher Convo. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter at OnTheRock81. We also are on Discord as well, and we can get those links through social media. But we at Crusher Convo look at TNG and review those episodes through the lens and the eyes of Beverly Crusher. So we put polls out, see what episode fans want to do next on Twitter. And then we have guests. And Peter, we'd love to have you on at some point. And we've had some amazing guests coming up, including Marcy, who is from Green Shirt, and Chris at Shelf Nerds. And we've had Open Pike Night on. We've had some great Beverly Crusher fans, our bonkers. So if you love Beverly Crusher and you love TNG, this might be the podcast for you. Give it a listen. And if you don't love Beverly Crusher, maybe you will after you give us a listen. Give her a chance. She's actually really awesome. And Jessie, my co-host, she really created Crusher Convo, and it's a real passion of hers. She just came to TNG recently and became a Star Trek fan through her love of Beverly Crusher and watching The Next Generation. So this is really her baby from summer of 2022, starting on Twitter Spaces. And right now we are doing weekly Twitter Space reviews of Star Trek Picard Season 3, where we air it Thursdays, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Twitter Spaces. We offer a forum to discuss the episode through the eyes of Beverly Crusher because she is in Season 3, and we are here for that.
I've had a chance to listen to some of Crusher Convo, and I also highly recommend it. So if you get a chance and you haven't listened yet, please do. It'll be a great show. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Peter.
And for myself, you can contact me. My Twitter handle is at PeterTrek1, the number 1. I have a short form Star Trek solo cast that's also on Spotify. It's called My Star Trek Life. So the link is on my Twitter profile. You could also find it through Spotify. And we also have at Trek Book Club, which is on Twitter. We read Star Trek books approximately once every 1.5 months, and we discuss it over a weekend. So you can give that a follow if you haven't followed us yet. It's at Trek Book Club on Twitter.
And I love Trek Book Club. That's kind of how I found you, Peter. We were discussing,
Yes.
I think, the Coda trilogy a little bit on there and some other Trek literature, and I absolutely recommend it. You do amazing deep dives.
Thank you.
And your questions, I feel like I'm at a master's class in a good way. It doesn't feel like work, but it feels like we're deep diving and digging into something that we love. And sometimes the authors participate, like David Mack did with Oblivion's Gate, and it's awesome to have that discourse.
Oh yeah, I mean that's definitely like the highlight of my experience hosting Trek Book Club discussions when the authors participate. So, I mean, David Mack participated in Oblivion's Gate and in Vanguard, and then we've had a couple of others as well participate in honor when they joining in and just sharing their unique perspectives on the novel.
And I'm so glad you brought back the podcast for Trek Book Club. It's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, Rob, who was the founder of Trek Book Club, started a podcast a few years ago, but put it on pause and kind of transitioned when he stepped away and from the hosting duties, and I came on board. And so I'm trying to bring the podcast back. I've had one episode already, which is A Pocket Full of Lies, the Voyager novel. So that's episode 1. This one's episode 2, and working on episode 3 behind the scenes. So we should be having that.
Episode 2 is pretty heavy, so I give you a lot of credit for that. Your spreadsheets are amazing, and you have walked me through Oblivion's Gate in a wonderful way. So thank you for that, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome, and thank you for appearing. Like, it's really great to have someone to talk to and just converse with. And like I said, I see these podcasts as more of a conversation between two Trek fans talking about a novel. So we had a great time.
Sure.
So thank you, Michelle. Thank you for all our listeners for listening to this show. This is Peter signing off. Live long and prosper.